Hello and welcome to this episode of Illumination Podcast. This is episode 59, and today we are talking about dynamic women in the spiritual world.
Welcome to the Illumination Podcast with Nick and Kisma, bringing you ancient wisdom for modern day success so that you can sparkle just a little bit brighter each and every day. If what you hear speaks to your soul, go ahead and give us a rating and a review in iTunes. You can also find us on SoundCloud and Stitcher. And hey, if there's somebody in your life that you think would enjoy this podcast, go ahead and share it with them.
Well, hello, dynamic woman.
Am I dynamic? Hello, Mr. Nick.
You are a dynamic woman. This is a unique podcast.
It is. It's so unique, and I'm so excited.
Our idea was it was for it to be an interview podcast to have this person on the show that we're going to talk mainly that we're going to talk about today. She is the daughter of Swami Parthasarathi. She plays a huge role in the Vedanta organization. And we asked her to be on our podcast. And at first I was like so excited and a little bit surprised because
and was
it was like,
not my idea?
It was your idea. And I was like, that's amazing. Like, what a great idea. And I was super excited. And then they said, yeah, that seems like a good idea. And then it turns out that, they didn't want to interview because they really never do that except for like a pure news organization, which we are not. Like
exactly.
Illumination Podcast has an agenda, and in order to keep their organization really clean and clear from aligning with any other organizations, as much as we're just huge supporters, they choose not to do that. If they do any media, it's only through an actual news organization.
Yeah, because if they get on our podcast, they have to be on like a dozen others, and they've already turned some down. I totally get it. I totally understand. It's really, they're so good. You know, the Vedanta Academy, Swamiji, they're so good at absolutely sticking to what their process is, which is why they have great success in all that they do.
And it turned out even better for us. And I think really for the podcast as a whole, because we were able to sit down with her, Sunandaji, and had we just interviewed her, you would have got a very much more stock what's that word I'm looking
overarching.
For? Yeah, overarching kind of view of what Vedanta is and how it works in the world.
Message, it would have been great.
Yeah, it'd be really great. But definitely something you can find on their website. But we turned the recorders off, and it was really just she and Kisma and I in a room, and then she had a couple of her son was one of them,
and her daughter
just sitting there to observe and to take a few photos. And what we got out of it was an intimate conversation that you would have never got if we had just sat down and had a conversation with her. Even some things that. And some stories that her son said, oh man, like,
I've never heard that.
I've never heard that before. Like, thank you guys so much. Yeah. So that kind of brings me to my first piece of it is it seems like, for her in particular, she's so making a stand for the organization and plays such an important role there. It seems like maybe there's not always a space for her to express herself personally like that. And what are your as a woman? I'm really curious about what your thoughts and your takes on this.
It's a great question. I mean, we've known her for several years. We were just at her retreat in Malibu, 3 months ago. I remember our first retreat at the Vedanta Academy, which would have been 7-8 years ago. And I heard her speak. Remember, she did the commentary on the poems, I think.
Yeah.
And I didn't know who she was. And I remember leaving like, who is that woman? She's awesome. And someone's like, oh, that's Swamiji's daughter. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So we have seen this teaching side of her again and again and again. And I've had some moments to be able to converse with her, basically getting advice where she was very heartfelt and very interested in my life. But you're right, like we never got into what is it like, number one, to be, she's a very well-known woman in India. So when you go down to South India, Chennai, she is really popular.
She's up on the billboards.
She is on the billboard. She does, she'll do, I don't know, is it 5 days of the Bhagavad Gita? I mean, she just, she's traveling. She comes to the States now. Like, she has a following. And every time I see her, I notice something different. Like, wow, Sunandaji is even more brilliant or even more focused or even more dedicated. And it amazes me to see that each time you can actually be more of what she already is.
And yeah, because she's so amazing. So the conversation today really is about, Sunandaji as a leader, but also as a woman, as a leader of a spiritual community, and how dynamic women function with this and some of the challenges that they encounter. So to that end, like starting out, one of the first things that she talked about was the intellect,
right?
Which is Vedanta's
lovely word. The
main message, is really about developing the intellect. Number one, so that you can get out of the negativity of the world and some of the negative cycles created by the human mind. But number two, so that you can get into the positivity and and maintain that direction and path towards your highest and best.
Right.
But she had some really beautiful ways to put it. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about,
Well, what I remember when she talked about the intellect is like, this isn't beautiful, but number one, she's like, nobody's aware that they even have this equipment. So for those of you that have been on our trainings or listened to other podcasts, we talk about mind, body, intellect, like these three equipments. And, when she opened with it, she's like, most people are operating at 30% of their personality. Brilliant people might be at 60%. So when they say operating at the 60% of the personality, they're talking about the whole person. And it's like not knowing that this intellect, this reasoning system, this governing system, this ability to direct the emotions higher, this ability to govern emotions is even there, is one of the biggest issues, I think, on our planet today in terms of basically the fall of humanity.
Yeah, we've set it up in such a way. I don't want to go all dark here, but as human beings, we've set up the world in such a way that everything can be undone right now with a push of a button.
Yeah. Let's move on from that. Sadly, it's true. But I think that stems from, as we've talked about, the education system. People are gathering knowledge and information from external agencies all the time. But the real key is to develop the critical thinking.
Yeah. The critical thinking, the self-analysis, and really and truly the focused on the highest and best, which brings us to the spiritual path, where you talk about the role of the subtle intellect. So the gross intellect focused towards the world.
Yeah, the gross intellect is here to help us manage our life, the world, relationships, people, understand, like pause, reflect, get it together, folks. Like that's the gross intellect. The subtle intellect. And when she dove into this, it was really, really beautiful because she's like, there is something else that will tell you, this isn't everything. Like for those of you out there that have ever just paused and went, is this it? That's your subtle intellect kind of knocking at the door saying, no, this isn't all there is. There's more. And, the deeper, or the more I should say, the subtle intellect is uncovered, the deeper one person can go on their spiritual journey.
Do you feel like there are unique challenges as a woman on this path?
Well, I don't, because I don't think that way. And honestly, I don't think she thinks that way. And I know that sometimes I get a little, I don't want to say in trouble, but I tend to just... Like, during this last presidential election, I remember saying, wait, we've never had a female president? Really? Like it wasn't front and center because I just kind of look at humans are humans. So I don't know because I don't think that way. I think for her, I don't think she thinks that way either. I mean, she raised 2 children. She had a marriage. She raised 2 children. She talked about that with us. We'll share some stories with that in a moment. But for her, she is immersed in the teachings and the journey. So there is no room for looking at, well, what's the problem? The problem is that people don't have an intellect and have not learned how to develop it. That, I think, is the problem that she addresses day in and day out. And everything is related to that.
They're so much more focused on the human problem, and not so much on gender, which is interesting, which actually makes the Vedanta Academy one of the most progressive in the world as far as gender roles, because because there's nothing there that the women and men are separated in their in their living arrangements unless they're married.
Right.
But other than that, there's nothing that any one sex would do that another wouldn't.
It's one of the only ashrams, probably the only ashram, where when people go to class, in fact, this was a fun story for Swamiji. In many ashrams, women will stand or sit on one side and men on the other. And at the Vedanta Academy, they don't. Everyone's intermingled. And I remember someone said something to him like, well, why is this? And he's like, I don't have different genders sitting in my class. I have souls sitting in my class. You just don't even go there. I think the only thing they do that's separate is early morning prayer. I know we were there on the retreat, but when it's not a retreat, the women and the men stand separately. In that first prayer. Everything else, meals, everything else is done together. I know I've talked to some of the girls on campus and they're like, oh yeah, Swamiji tells us to have our own bank balance. For some of the Indian students, he's always saying to the women, go out and learn how to drive. Like do not be dependent on another human. You must be fully independent to take care of yourself. And I love that. So when the foundation of the message of the ashram is that, there's not going to be much issue of someone's being a man or a woman.
It's pretty radical in the spiritual community.
It's pretty radical in the spiritual community in India. It really is. But that's him. He's not looking at this is a girl, this is a boy. He's like, these are humans and they have these equipments and I want them to elevate.
Yeah.
As is Sunandaji. So back to the subtle intellect, what is so precious when she starts talking about, she's like, what is beyond, like what makes you perceive? What makes you think? What is it that allows you to move your body? There's something greater than just this physical body that you touch or what you see. Like, what is that energy? We use the word energy, they don't so much, but what is that energy running through a human that allows them to do, that supports them to do all these things?
The divine spark.
The divine spark.
It's eternal. And you brushed on this just briefly, but I wanted to circle back and dive into it a bit where we actually got her to talk a little bit more about reincarnation.
Oh, I know. That was juicy.
And that's always cool, to hear somebody talk about this.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could share a few thoughts.
Yeah. And I'll just preface this by saying, our podcast, we love talking about what we study. We're in no way saying go and believe what we're talking about, but it's such a fascinating conversation to be able to ask questions of someone that has studied this for years and years and years. And reincarnation in the spiritual teachings is still a theory, right? It cannot be proven. Of course, some of you may have gone through past life readings, or some of you might come upon someone and be like, wow, I feel like I knew that person before. None of this is coincidence, right? This is real, but reincarnation is a theory. Now, the reason it's a theory and studied by the sages for centuries is one of the things is you look at a family and two children come in with completely and radically different personalities or different experiences, or they grow up and they're completely different. What is it that they're bringing into the world? Right. So, and then what are you leaving this world with? That's one of their passions, is like, you can't take your money. You can't take your new car, when you leave this planet, but you take your wisdom and you take your desires. So the whole teaching is, as you elevate your desires and you go on to your next experience, the next experience is greater and better than this experience. And how people came in, this fundamental universal law of cause and effect. Everything is based on cause and effect. We see effects all the time, but we don't always see the causes.
Yep. And that's the confusing part.
That's the confusing part. Why is one child completely healthy and another one isn't? And I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole here because I certainly don't want anybody to take anything wrong. It's not up to us. And karma isn't that way, right? Many people are like, oh, you did something bad. Bad karma. Karma is not bad or good. Karma just is, right? So there is an effect and there's a cause to everything. So they have studied this, time and time again, how people come in, how they come in differently, how their lives are, what is behind that.
Yeah. And it gets frustrating, I think, sometimes when you see these causes or see the effects, the destruction or the challenge or the, like whatever that is. And then you just can't seem to wrap your head around the cause, and then the mind gets all entangled with it. So it's a conversation that they measure out, carefully. And any teacher I've ever worked with has really been like, not guarded around it, but just really specific about how they express and talk about this theory of reincarnation, because it is so easy for the mind to just go mad in that whole conversation.
And that's not the point of
and
why
it's not
you're
helpful.
Here, right? And she even talked about that. She's like, communities can spin themselves out on thinking about this rather than being here and now and taking the action in the world that they're required to take. Right. So it's kind of like tempering the balance of asking questions and taking action. You want to gain the knowledge, like the knowledge and putting it into action, embodying it, making it elevate into the wisdom is so essential. So if you're focusing on a past life or what you think was a past life, you're not present to the present moment.
Exactly.
And I would share too, because I'm really picky about certainly any spiritual conversation I have or any kind of energy work, when people do past life readings, I know I've had to clean up people coming to me and someone's like, well, I did this past life reading and someone said I'm going to die at age 56. I can't stop thinking about it. Well, that's really great. Okay. So this is not the kind of conversation that's going to elevate you.
I just don't understand that. But back to Sunandaji and kind of her history. Her father is the founder of this Vedanta Academy. He's like the preeminent proponent of Vedanta philosophy. There are definitely other Vedanta organizations out there, but none that I've ever seen come close to the body of work and the depth that he's created. Yeah. And this is her dad.
Right.
So pretty interesting, I would think, to grow up in a family like that. And
it's a little bit like Carrie Fisher growing up with Debbie Reynolds.
A little bit like that.
Although on the spiritual plane, right?
Yeah, a little bit
wasn't
different.
the drama in the trauma.
But she talked a little bit about, how she came into the philosophy and how it was presented to her, So, what did you take away from that?
There were a couple of things. I mean, I think what started to happen for her as she was speaking, she said the question really was not so much when she became so interested in the knowledge, but when she became so disinterested in the daily affairs of the world. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
It's like all of a sudden these things that were happening daily just were not of interest to her, right? So she talked about, she's very joyful. She has a great personality. And when she was young, I mean, she's not very old now, she's 60, I think. But, when she was a schoolgirl and they'd go out on picnics or whatever, and she said nobody wanted to do anything without her there, right? So she was the cheerful and joyful one. But she said it always ended up like by the time the picnic or whatever they were doing was almost over, she'd stop and she'd say to her friends, like, don't you think there's something more? Like, isn't there something more than this? And they'd be like, oh my gosh, there you go with your philosophy again. But it was always on her mind. Isn't there something more than this beautiful group of friends or the sky or this tree, or what makes the sky and the tree, or what makes us all talk? Like the inquiry and the curious mind, it was just like the day-to-day world became so mundane.
Yeah, just less and less interesting. And back then, her dad hadn't written all the books.
He hadn't written this glorious library of teachings, but she was growing up in an ashram.
Right. And then there were these, there were some things that he had written and she and some books that they had been studying. And I remember her talking about where her dad came into her room and she had one of those books or like a collection of notes on her desk.
Yeah, I think it was a book. It might have even been one of the Swami Ramatirtha books.
I think you're right. Yeah.
And not sure, but she had a couple. Yeah.
And he started questioning her about it.
Yeah. And she got really nervous. She's like, oh no. Because he said, how are you studying these? How far along are you? And immediately, isn't this cute? Like back then, I think she was 16 or 17. She was thinking, oh my gosh, like I'm not good enough. I didn't go fast enough. She totally worried what he was thinking. And she was honest though. She's like, I'm still on the first page. And he just said, good. That's the way you study.
Yeah.
Like go deep, not fast.
Yeah.
And from that point on, you can see it too. When she talked about, it was like a shift in her. She's like, oh, wow, like, okay, he gave me the approval. I got it. I'm just going to keep going and going. And she would snag little notes and things. I think, when he had meetings or teachings or whatever, it's sort of like it reminded me how children, at least in this country, when they're growing up, when I was growing up, the kids would like sit on the steps and listen to the adults, have a cocktail party. I don't know if you ever did that.
Oh,
But,
of course I did.
it's like, oh, what are the adults talking about? And she would be like, what's the guru talking about?
She would always be watching. Yeah. Which reminds me of something that another one of our teachers has continually said. And she's just said, keep your eye on the teacher, like always keep your eye on the teacher. What I think was important and really poignant about that story is that he didn't like do a big cheer for her and get all like, try to reinforce that with a lot of, rah rah type of thing or anything like you're so good or anything like that. He was basically just like, good, that's the way you do it.
Exactly.
And that was it. That was it. So it's that kind of like, I think so many times you can speak to this more directly than I, but so many times like parents are trying to like really encourage the path that they want them to take and maybe discourage the other ones. And so they heap praise in certain areas, but not so much in other areas. And at the end of the day, like that child needs to be really independent. They need to be convicted in their own choices.
Right.
And that builds when you let them continue to come to that conclusion.
Totally.
So as the master teacher, he just, really measured out the proper amount for that. And good.
Yeah.
Good.
And
that's the way you do
he
it.
was like, it's the depth of study, right? It's the total depth of study. And then true, it's like as she talked a bit about being in university and how it was actually a challenge because she wasn't studying what she wanted to study. She wanted to be back studying the philosophy. And I believe it was another conversation with she talked a lot about Swamiji and then Swamiji's father, her grandfather. And I didn't realize how close she was to him.
I didn't realize that at all.
Yeah.
I hadn't really even heard Swamiji talk about his father too often.
Maybe a little bit.
Yeah, every once in a while, but not her especially.
Right.
And I didn't really understand what kind of a character or personality he was in their lives.
Well, just a little backstory. When you think about Swami Parthasarathy was born into what I understand, a wealthy shipping family. Like they had the shipping business in India. And as most traditional families, I'm sure there was an element of being expected, I'm going to take over the family business. That wasn't his interest, right? So we'll talk about Svadharma in another podcast, but like his nature, it wasn't. And he had always been interested in the philosophy. And interesting when we talk about reincarnation or choosing a family, he landed with this father who understood because the father had an interest.
Yeah. And when Swamiji was, I think a little worried that his dad would be disappointed and everything like that. And his dad actually said, well, I just so admire your courage because this is something that I wanted to do that I never did.
Yeah. And so the blessing, he went off to the ashram. He was married, which is sometimes unusual, but that's the way it was. And he had a child, and there she was. She grew up in the ashram, and
they had to do some finagling.
They had to do some finagling,
yeah, because
right,
you weren't is Chinmanaya ashram, which is still going, even though the teacher has passed. But you're not supposed to be married.
Right,
you can't be in there and
came
be
in
married.
As the driver or something.
Yes, but Chinmanaya saw the potential of Swamiji and was like, wow, this guy's got something here. And he wants to be here. He happens to be married. So they bent the rules, or they found a way around. They didn't even bend the rules. They found a way around the rules. And he just said, I need a driver. And so Swamiji was basically hired as the driver so his family could live.
He loved cars too.
At the ashram. He does love cars, yeah. And all those Mercedes, a couple of Mercedes around. It's cool. Like no poverty consciousness at the ashram is so cool. Yeah. And that was how he was allowed into the ashram to study. It was really as a driver.
That's so cool.
So yeah.
But, I remember too when she was talking, because I think the question that we posed was, when did you know that you wanted to study this? And she said 16 or 17. But again, the question really was how she looked at day-to-day life that was not as interesting. And then when she had that grasp on the knowledge, she's like, I never looked back. It was like always looking forward. When can I be in front of, Swamiji or my grandfather? When can I get back to the knowledge? So his advice to her, you know, university was a struggle. Is like, it's an obligation, finish it.
Mm-hmm.
And so she did. And then she dove deep into the study. She was married. She was raising 2 kids, but she talks about, I would find this way like to get back to him, to hear what he was teaching, to see what he was writing.
Yeah, which is interesting. You know, she had to have that conversation with her. It was an arranged marriage.
Yeah. Well,
And-
they all, I think, pretty much were then.
Yeah, that was very, very common. Less common now, but still happens quite a bit.
Yeah.
But I remember her talking about the conversation that she had to have with her new husband. And she like, you know,
This is what I want.
yeah, I'm committed to you, and I understand, you know, my obligations as a wife and everything. But this is something that you might find a little peculiar about me, is that I have an intense interest in this study, and my father with the ashram and everything, and
I'm going to study this philosophy and no one's going to stop me.
basically, yeah, was the message that was delivered in a really sweet way.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. So she did. And it was like, you know, she talked about the answers. I'm looking for the answers, and the answers are in these books. The answers are in this knowledge. The answers are in these teachings. And she's like, you know, I remember her saying, anything can happen to anyone. You know, take everything or do anything in the world. She's like, I have something else to go back to. And she's like, that was my inner strength. And she used the word oasis. And I thought, what a perfect word.
Yeah, always coming back.
Yeah,
you know,
always
just-
coming back to this oasis. And that's the thing, everybody, you know, when you find, whether it's what we talk about or it's something else, when you have that pulse, when you have that inner strength, when you have that thing that is more than just every day, it is an oasis.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it gets you out of the mundane world and helps you reconnect with that mystery within yourself.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and to just really try to understand the magic that's happening in order for us to have this human experience.
Right.
You know,
Totally.
it really is phenomenal.
Yeah.
But it keeps coming back to that idea of when what I saw in her and what I continue to see in her is this conviction that is just
Yeah.
so rock solid. You know, it's no joke. From Chennai to Mumbai, she was living in Chennai.
Yeah.
Her father and the ashram were in Mumbai. And she was going back and forth whenever she possibly could. So
On a train, like the train
there's
of truth.
train of truth right there. There's an Indian train of truth too. Remember, we were talking and the train drove by. I even had it in my notes. I was like, "There's an Indian train of truth." But that conviction, where so many times, you know, we hit a roadblock in
Yeah.
our goals, just in like business goals or life goals or whatever, not even in spiritual goals. And it's like, we find these excuses to stop. And it's because that inner conviction hasn't really been developed.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and only you can do that. Like
Yeah.
the motivation ain't going to do it. You know,
Yeah.
some rah conversation isn't going to really last the distance. It might get you through a little rough patch, but sooner or later you're going to face the exact same problems. And when I look at somebody like her, who's got a husband, who's got kids, you know, but is just constantly drawn back to this knowledge and to
Right.
these teachings and to her father, the teacher, to absorb as much of it as she possibly can. She just found a way.
She just found a way. Yeah. I remember she was like, she described her grandfather so unflusterable, right? He was just, nothing bothered him, but he had this strength, right? He would just walk into the room and people could feel him. It was like this conviction, this strength, but really cool disposition, not unloving, but really strong.
Yeah.
And she's just like, I would do anything for these guys. You know, I want to be like them.
She had a pair of his glasses.
She had a pair of his specs.
Yeah, that was so
It was
cute.
really cool.
I was a little surprised. Typically, the Vedanta folk are
Don't
not
have the attachment to
super
things.
sentimental about
Yeah.
things like that. But to sit in her office there and to look at the bookshelf, she had some special books, and then her grandfather's spectacles sitting there because he was he's a wealthy man, but he just wouldn't spend money on himself, and so those spectacles, like, he just had them forever, you know.
Yeah.
And she found them and kept them, which I thought was really, really cute. And so through all of that and through all of those challenges, you know, she did all of that, never neglected her marriage, always just found a way through in order to keep on the path.
Yeah.
You know, which is extraordinary.
And I believe, you know, because she has such great success now in being a spiritual teacher and a leader, you know, she talked a lot. And I think this is why, because it's people understand it. it's like put the right value on things, the external pursuits. Money is important. She's like, have money, have what you want. But again, don't let it own you. And it was like your pockets can be full or they can be empty. But even if they're full, there's still this void within. It's not the be all and the end all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really putting a value. So what's the value on your day-to-day activities? What's the value on what you're putting into your brain, into your mind? What is it that you're being contacted with in the world? To look at those things and be willing to say to yourself, I'm going to be around things and people that have a high value.
High value. Yeah. Yeah. That's in the more that, I think we talked about this in the last episode as well, about just continuing to enroll yourself in that value is really what builds your conviction for it.
Right.
And I just can't think of a better model, and I think it's so cool and so appropriate for our age that it's a woman model.
Yeah, it's really, really perfect. And, she said, this might help some of you listening. It's like people worry about a lot. And people are worried about what they lose. But she said, let the spark happen. Like when you get that internal spark of something, really let it happen, because that's what will cultivate a completely new attitude, new perception, and of course, new habits and characters and way of living. So it was like that spark. It was such a beautiful word.
Yeah.
It's like nurture the spark and follow the spark.
It reminded me that is something just personally that I've done, is to keep coming back to that spark. I think maybe not with the same conviction, but always like that's something that's just constantly drawn me back and something I've always been fascinated with. And it really is easy to get just so swept up in everyday life and to just forget about it. And, it doesn't matter, or all these other things seem so much more important because they're vying for your attention, left and right. But it's that quiet voice and that inner spark that just is really where it's at. And that kind of brings me to some of the advice that she left for us, because the question that we asked her was, hey, like, this is not the easiest path. Like, there are other spiritual paths that definitely are.
Let's do a little ayahuasca and meditate.
Yeah. Like, we'll go do some drugs and have some deep conversations, or, we're just going to go and hug each other and feel better, which is fine. Like, I don't mean to insult that. It's just like, that's one way. Vedanta is definitely a path for the serious student and somebody who really wants the answers. And it's not an easy path. The spiritual path overall, when you're really going to dissect it, can become very challenging along the way. It is something that will be tested. And so to that end, we asked her, well, what are some of the, what is your advice for somebody who wants to take this up right off the bat? And the first thing she said is that don't bother if you don't have some fundamental questions.
Oh, yeah.
Right. This isn't something that you just kind of want to learn about as a hobby. Like, if you're not really asking, who am I? Why am I here? What is this human experience and what's actually going on here? Then you should probably not, like
it'll just be frustrating.
Yeah. Or you'll just read it and it'll just be a waste of time, because it won't really help you that way. So it's that inward call, like once you start to have those questions, and sooner or later, every human being has those questions.
You would hope so.
I think most people at some point or another ask that. It's how quickly they brush it under the carpet.
Exactly. How quickly they ignore it.
Yeah, that determines how far they go. But she said, keep nurturing that inward call.
Yes.
Like, you've got this call, like keep nurturing it.
Yeah. The spark.
And another thing that she mentioned is that, how just people aren't honest with themselves.
Yeah, right.
And that can be such a challenge. So it's just to be really honest and accepting with yourself for where you're at.
Yeah. And even, that reminds me of like how she described her marriage. I mean, great marriage. They're still together, although he's in Chennai and she's at the ashram and their children are grown and her son is at the ashram, which is so cool. But she was just really open. She goes, all this like lovey-dovey stuff and whatever, it just didn't make sense to me. Like in that, this is just her. Like, she was always going back to the knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And thankfully, because she really is proving to be a leader in this teachings and someone that's leading the movement needs to be that much on the quest and that convicted with it.
Yeah. And so humble too.
And so
You know,
humble.
when her father's teaching,
Oh yeah, she's sitting right there taking notes.
she's sitting right there taking notes with everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really fascinating to watch, and really truly one of the most special stories that she shared was how then she'd be at the ashram. She had taken this up, and every morning there's study time, right? So she would go to her father and ask him to write something in her notebook.
Yeah, she'd say, I just slip my notebook on his desk and be like, I'm heading off to school, but can you just write one thing?
And he would write a quote or a something in there for her. And it was so cool to see her light up around that. And I just thought, like, wow, that's so amazing.
What 16 or 17-year-old is looking for that?
Here's a couple words on a piece of paper, and that's the most precious thing to her.
Yeah.
Not just being from her father, but really being the knowledge that she's so passionate about fully gaining and understanding. And it's just like, wow.
That was great. And she's the one that discovered all of Swamiji's writings, remember, in the bungalow. And then she hired somebody to come and put them into these books.
So this is a cool little aside story, actually, is that he's written all these books, 10, 12 books now, some of them extremely thick. And when he wrote them, he sits down between 4 and 6 every morning and he writes the books. But when you look at the manuscripts for them, there's nothing crossed out.
Yeah, it's perfect.
The handwriting is immaculate.
Yeah. And back then he didn't use lines and it was like completely straight.
Yeah. And it's pretty much exactly what wound up in the book. Like there might have been a comma moved here or there, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
So she discovered all these manuscripts and typical Vedanta guy, he's like, we don't need that.
Yeah, like
whatever.
Why do you want to do that?
Why do you want to do that? But it's like, it really is for posterity. And so she was responsible for,
and they're so beautiful,
taking those and having them preserved and so that they'll be around for a while. And we were trying to talk them into making some special editions and selling them at a high ticket, a couple $100 for one of those puppies. I don't know if they'll do it, but I would 100% buy one of those. Yeah.
I would say too, as we close out, just from a woman's perspective, because that's kind of how we, talked about this podcast, like having a woman as a really true spiritual leader, her devotion. And there's something about the divine feminine energy that when it's embodied with that kind of devotion and knowledge, it is so clear. It is so focused. It is so strong and so much conviction with so much love and devotion. I haven't witnessed it before, except there at the academy.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a special feminine energy that I just think because they have, well, especially Sunandaji, she's just studied and has practiced and has mastered this. And it is like single pointed focus, conviction, and devotion with this warmth, but also just an objectivity.
Total objectivity.
Really, really powerful.
It's so beautiful. I think strong women leaders are needed,
Totally.
And in my mind, she's one of the most beautiful models I've ever seen for that. Just a very, very powerful woman, very dynamic, very engaging, and just so incredibly knowledgeable about what she does, so committed to just the highest level of excellence. It's amazing.
It is great. So we are very grateful. Thank you for being here, everyone, for listening. If you have any questions, info@sourcemovement.com. And until next time, a very heartfelt namaste.
Namaste.